Good evening, dear companion, in this quiet night. If you're searching for a moment of stillness to relax, to gently let go of the burdens of a long day, then let this voice guide you into the gentle current of history. Soft, yet thought-provoking. Tonight, we will turn the pages of the past together, where the shadow of power and madness loomed over the throne. This is a story of the worst kings of the medieval era, men who once held the fate of nations in their hands, yet were consumed by violence, delusion, and a loss of control. In the stillness of this night, walk with me in their footsteps, to understand, to feel, and then quietly close a chapter with a peaceful sleep. When Charles VI ascended the throne in 1380, he was only 11 years old. France at the time was in desperate need of hope after years of hardship in the 100 Years' War with England. Charles emerged as a symbol of youth, elegance, and a promising future. The people called him Charles the Beloved, not just because of his age, but also for his calm demeanor and early efforts to bring stability to the nation. With the support of regents and the Queen, the first years of his reign passed relatively peacefully. When he came of age and officially took the reins of power, Charles proved to be a capable king. He valued peace, paid attention to state affairs, encouraged art and literature, and maintained the respect of both the court and the people. Under young Charles, France seemed to be entering a new renaissance, but all that light shattered in a single fateful night. In 1393, a royal celebration was held in the palace to mark the wedding of a nobleman. It was a ball to ardents, the ball of the burning men, a strange performance in which Charles and 5 other nobles took part. They dressed as wild men, wearing costumes made of linen soaked in wax and resin, covered in flax fibers to resemble forest creatures. The costumes were elaborate, but highly flammable. During the festivities, Louis, Duke of Orleans, unaware of the danger, entered the hall holding a lit torch. As he approached the dancers, the fire caught. The nobles went up in flames like living torches. Screams and chaos echoed to the grand hall. Charles was lucky. The Duchess of Berry threw her skirts over him and shielded him from the fire. But 4 others weren't so fortunate. They were burned alive, dying in agony within the palace walls. Charles survived physically, but his mind was never the same. After that haunting night, the first signs of mental illness began to appear in the young king. At first, it was insomnia and strained behavior, speaking to people who weren't there, suddenly failing to recognize the queen or trusted courtiers. Over time, the episodes worsened. Once, Charles drew a sword in the street and attacked his guards, thinking they were assassins. On another occasion, he refused to let anyone touch him, believing he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. The court descended into turmoil. His lucid periods grew shorter. Each bout of madness opened the door for political factions to seize power. His brother, the Duke of Orleans, and the Duke of Burgundy alternated as regents, leading to a bloody feud between their houses. That conflict eventually escalated into the Armagnac, Burgundian Civil War, a drawn-out internal conflict that fractured France for decades. At the same time, England, the eternal rival, quickly took advantage of the situation. They launched powerful offensives into French territory, claiming a rightful claim to the throne on behalf of the Plantagenet line. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, signed while Charles was nearly incapacitated, handed the crown over to Henry V of England, an unprecedented humiliation for the French monarchy. From a king once praised for his virtue and refinement, Charles VI had become a symbol of madness and disintegration. His mental decline was not just a personal tragedy. It dragged an entire kingdom into collapse. By the time of his death in 1422, France was deep in war, internal division, and foreign occupation. The story of Charles VI stands as a painful warning about the burden of power, especially when placed on a fragile mind. In an age when mental illness was seen as a curse or divine punishment, no one knew how to help Charles, only how to use him. History remembers him as Charles the Mad, but few still recall that before the light in his mind was extinguished, he was once Charles the Beloved, a young king with bright eyes, a love of peace, and the dream of building a flourishing France. In his tragedy, we see clearly that the fragility of the human mind is something that should never be taken lightly, even if that mind wears a crown. When speaking of the worst kings in medieval history, the name of Henry VI of England often appears. not because of cruelty or a thirst for power, but because he was too gentle. In a world full of schemes, bloodshed, and fierce battles for the throne, Henry's kindness, piety, and moral integrity did not make him a great king. On the contrary, his softness helped plunge England into one of the bloodiest civil wars in its history, the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI was born in 1421, the only son of King Henry V, a legendary warrior king of England. At just 9 months old, Henry VI ascended the throne after his father's sudden death, becoming the youngest monarch in English history. During his early years, the kingdom was governed by regents. While young Henry was raised in an environment steeped in reverence and religious devotion, influences that shaped his character profoundly. Unlike his father, the fearsome conqueror of Agincourt, Henry VI grew up with gentle soul, shy and deeply trusting in God. He had no interest in war, hunting, or the game of power. Instead, he spent his time praying, reading the Bible, and founding educational institutions. Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, two of the most prestigious schools in England today, were his educational legacies. A king with virtue and compassion should have been a blessing, but in the political climate of England at the time, those very qualities became a disaster. Throughout his reign, Henry VI persistently sought peace with France, a position that angered many nobles and military leaders. His appeasement was seen as weakness. Especially controversial was his marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a French princess, which brought no dowry or territorial gains, but instead cost England strategically important lands previously conquered by his father. This led to public outrage and deepening division within the court. More dangerously, Henry lacked the skill to manage internal factions within the royal family. While he was immersed in prayer and charity, powerful nobles like the houses of York and Lancaster quietly amassed influence. Disputes over royal succession, political control, and economic power gradually ignited the flames of civil war. Henry, instead of being a peacemaker, became the weak point that allowed the kingdom to spiral into chaos. In 1453, a tragic turning point occurred. Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown. He became unresponsive, mute, and utterly incapable of ruling. For over a year, he lived like a shadow, staring into empty space, disconnected from the world. His wife, Queen Margaret, attempted to govern in his stead, but this only intensified the anger of the nobility, particularly from the Yorkist side. This mental collapse coincided with the final loss of English territories in France, except for the port of Calais. The defeat was a national humiliation and shattered public confidence in the monarchy. Henry's weakness opened the door to the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long civil war between the House of York, White Rose, and the House of Lancaster, Red Rose, over control of the English crown. Henry, as the figurehead of the Lancastrian cause, became a pawn in a brutal political game. He was captured, deposed, restored, and captured again, his life reduced to a cycle of manipulation by more powerful players. In 1471, after the Yorkists had achieved complete victory, Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Not long after, he died under mysterious circumstances, widely believed to have been murdered to eliminate any remaining threat to the new regime. Henry's death marked not only the end of the dynasty, but also served as a symbol of how royal power could be undone by its own compassion. He was not a tyrant, nor a despot, but in a world where power and cunning were the keys to survival, a king who was too gentle became a tragedy for an entire nation. Henry VI stands as a vivid reminder of a harsh truth. To rule is not only to be good, but to be strong and decisive. In his turbulent reign, he chose a path of kindness, but lacked the strength to lead. In the end, his indecision and helplessness left a lasting scar on England's history, a fratricidal war that claimed thousands of lives and fractured the very foundation of royal stability for nearly a century. Eric XIV is one of the most well-known kings in Swedish history, but not for his greatness. Rather, he is remembered for the deep tragedy of his life and reign. He embodied a stark contrast. A man who began with the light of knowledge, art, and high expectations, but ended in the darkness of madness, isolation, and a death shrouded in suspicion. Eric's story is a sorrowful reminder of the price paid when great power is entrusted to a fragile mind. Born in 1533, Eric was the son of King Gustav I, the founder of Sweden's independence from the Kalmar Union and the architect of the Vasa dynasty. From a young age, Erik showed remarkable intelligence. He received a rigorous education, mastering Latin, Greek, German, and French, and developed a deep passion for philosophy, astronomy, and classical history. He kept journals, wrote poetry, and had a fierce enthusiasm for the arts, architecture, and science. A true Renaissance prince in the cold north. In 1560, upon the death of his father, Erik ascended the throne at the age of 27, becoming Erik XIV of Sweden. His coronation in Uppsala was a grand affair, with days of feast, horseback tournaments, fencing contests, and music. The entire nation hoped for a new era of enlightenment and prosperity under this learned and charming young king. But the tragedy began with those very expectations. From the early years of his reign, Erik showed signs of mental instability. He became unpredictable, prone to sudden rage, and deeply jealous of those he suspected of threatening his rule. Instead of using his intellect to resolve internal tensions within the royal family, tensions that had already simmered during his father's reign, Erik grew increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. He trusted no one, frequently surveilling, interrogating, and when he deemed necessary, ordering executions. The first major victims of this paranoia were the nobles of the Sture family, a powerful and historically influential house in Sweden. Erik believed they were plotting against him, and though there was no solid evidence, he acted with brutal decisiveness. In 1567, during a fit of violent fury, Erik personally murdered Nils Sture, a young and harmless noble, with a dagger inside a prison cell. Rather than finding clarity afterward, Erik descended further into delusions and madness. He would wear black robes, mutter to himself in the palace halls, avoid contact with his courtiers, and behave in strange, terrifying ways. Fear spread throughout the court. Nobles began to withdraw, and even his most loyal followers started to question the king's ability to rule. Meanwhile, Erik's younger brothers, especially Prince John, quietly organized support to remove their brother from the throne, arguing that the king is no longer sane and Sweden is in danger. In 1568, a coup was launched. Erik was captured and imprisoned at Grip's home castle. Although he was never publicly executed, he lived out his final years in strict isolation, stripped of his title and power. His devoted wife, Karen Mansdottir, remained by his side and cared for him until the very end. She was the only person who could calm his fits of panic and hallucination, a gentle presence for a man who once dreamed of creating a golden age for his kingdom. Erik XIV died in 1577 at the age of 43. Though the official cause of death was listed as natural illness, many historical accounts and rumors suggest he was poisoned, possibly on the orders of his brother, King John III, who had succeeded him. Erik's burial was simple and without a grand funeral, as if history itself wished to quietly close a chapter of his troubled reign. Yet death could not erase what Erik XIV had once represented, both the soaring hopes of the beginning and the bitter disappointments that followed. He remains a symbol of what a dynasty might have become, had his mind been strong enough to bear the brilliant intellect he possessed. Erik's life serves as a harsh reminder that knowledge without inner balance can become a double-edged sword, and power, when not anchored by a sound mind, will inevitably lead a person into the deepest abyss of their own soul. Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, a reign of blood, fear, and solitude. Ivan IV, widely known by his infamous title Ivan the Terrible, is one of the most complex and terrifying figures in Russian history. He was not only the first Tsar of Russia, but also the man who shaped the nation's destiny through a combination of radical reforms and unprecedented brutality. His life was a blend of triumphant glory and the darkness of paranoia and madness, the childhood of a future tyrant. Ivan was born in 1530, during a time when Russia was still a fragmented feudal state, with power divided among noble families, especially the powerful boyars. He ascended the throne at just 3 years old after the sudden death of his father, becoming Grand Prince of Moscow. However, real control remained in the hands of regents, mostly nobles embroiled in their own power struggles. Ivan's childhood was one of instability. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, was poisoned when he was only 8. The young boy grew up isolated in the Kremlin, often hungry, neglected, and a witness to the cruelty and infighting of the nobility. These early traumas planted a deep-rooted obsession with power, betrayal, and the fear of being murdered, ruling with both intellect and wrath. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was officially crowned the first Tsar of all Russia, a title that carried divine and absolute authority, on par with the Byzantine emperor. In the early years of his reign, Ivan proved to be a progressive and intelligent ruler. He reformed the legal system, established a standing army, reorganized the government, curtailed the power of the boyars, and strengthened the central state. Most notably, he expanded Russia's territory southeastward, conquering Kazan and Astrakhan, pushing the country closer to becoming a formidable empire. Ivan was also a remarkably learned man for his time. He was an avid reader, deeply interested in theology and philosophy, and possessed a powerful gift for oratory. But the light of his intellect was soon overshadowed by the darkness within, a darkness born of personal loss. The tragedy begins: Anastasia's death. Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's first wife, was the rare calm in his stormy life. Intelligent and composed, she was his emotional anchor. But in 1560, Anastasia died suddenly, and Ivan became convinced she had been poisoned by the very nobles he had long distrusted. Her death shattered him. From that point on, the rational yet stern king transformed into a suspicious, jealous, angry, and vengeful tyrant. He began eliminating anyone he suspected of betrayal, often with no evidence. And then came one of the bloodiest instruments of his rule, the Oprichniki. The Oprichniki, terror in black robes. Formed in 1565, the Oprichniki were a secret police loyal only to Ivan, with special authority to cleanse Russia traitors. They rode black horses, wore black robes, and bore symbols of a dog's head and a broom, representing the sniffing out of treason and the sweeping away of enemies. Under the Oprichniki, Russia descended into hell. They arrested, tortured, looted, and massacred nobles, merchants, and commoners alike, without need for warrants or trials. The city of Novgorod, suspected of treason, suffered horrific destruction. Tens of thousands were killed in a brutal purge. The shocking event, killing his own son. Ivan's cruelty reached its darkest point in 1581, when during an argument over his treatment of his pregnant daughter-in-law, he struck his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with a staff. The blow was fatal. When Ivan realized he had killed his only competent successor, he was consumed by madness and grief. He wept and repented, but it was too late. The death of his son marked the symbolic collapse of his dynasty, and served as a devastating testament to the destruction wrought by unchecked power. A strange death and a haunting legacy. Ivan IV died in 1584 while playing chess. According to legend, just after moving his king into check, he collapsed at the board, a grim metaphor for his own fate. His legacy remains a deep scar on Russia's psyche. Ivan was the architect, a unified and expanded Russian state, laying the groundwork for future empire. But he also became a symbol of ruthless tyranny, spreading fear and madness through every corner of the nation. In Russian culture, Ivan is remembered as both a hero and a demon, a dual figure that defies forgetting. Justin II of Byzantium, an empire crumbling beneath a mad emperor. When we speak of the worst kings of the medieval era, names like Ivan the Terrible or Charles the Mad often come to mind. Yet few recall that in the eastern Mediterranean, deep within the heart of the Byzantine Empire, there once ruled an emperor named Justin II, whose descent into mental illness not only destroyed himself but dragged down the remnants of a once mighty empire. Justin II ascended the throne in 565 AD, succeeding his legendary uncle, Justinian I, the emperor who had expanded Byzantine territory to its greatest extent and left an enduring legacy through monumental works like the Hagia Sophia and the codification of Roman law. But this inheritance was a double-edged sword. Justin didn't just inherit a throne. He inherited an empire weakened by decades of war, crippled by debt, and seething with religious and ethnic tensions. From the very beginning of his reign, Justin II showed a lack of leadership. While he longed to follow in the footsteps of his illustrious uncle and restore the empire's greatness, reality proved far more unforgiving. His early decisions, such as cutting subsidies to client states or using force against the Avars and Lombards, led to disastrous consequences. The Balkans fell into disorder, tensions flared on the eastern border with Persia, and the Central Army grew increasingly resentful due to unpaid wages. But what alarmed the court even more was the rapid emergence of Justin's mental instability. Contemporary historians like John of Ephesus recorded that the emperor became paranoid, easily enraged, and frequently lost control of his emotions. He claimed to hear whispers, screamed incoherently, and at times even bit his servants during frenzied episodes. Imperial audiences grew chaotic as Justin's behavior became more erratic and disconnected from reality. One of his most bizarre delusions was a belief that people were trying to assassinate him with their gaze. To counter this, he isolated himself within the palace, ordering guards not to look directly at him and banning any loud noises near his quarters, which he believed could injure him with sound. His room was padded with thick cloth, windows were sealed, and attendants were forced to walk barefoot to avoid making noise. As the emperor's mind fractured, so too did the political structure of the empire. With Justin unable to govern, court officials and generals began jostling for power. Meanwhile, the Persian king Khosrow seized a moment, launching a full-scale war on the eastern frontier and capturing key Byzantine territories in Armenia and Syria. To the west, the Lombards, left unchecked after Justin's withdrawal of troops, surged into Italy, taking city after city that Justinian had once bled to reclaim from the Goths. These lands quickly descended into chaos, and the populace lost faith in the emperor's ability to protect them. In outlying provinces like North African Spain, calls for autonomy or outright secession began to grow, pushing the already fragmented empire closer to collapse. In a final desperate attempt to maintain the throne, Justin II named his loyal general Tiberius as Caesar and his official successor. But by then, Justin's mind had fully detached from reality. He lay in delirium for hours, unable to recognize his wife or children, speaking to phantom figures in his imagination. Some sources even claimed he believed he was already dead, ruling a kingdom in the afterlife. Justin II died in 578, confused and alone, with no victories to his name, no legacy to uphold, and no one left who trusted him. His reign ended as a sobering reminder of how fragile power truly is, and the horrific cost a nation can pay when its fate lies in the hands of a ruler unraveling from within. But Justin's story is not just about madness. It is the tragedy of a lonely soul, devoured by the shadow of the past and the unbearable weight of a crown. In the silence of the palace walls, amid whispered hallucinations and the fearful glances of barefoot servants, an empire that once dazzled the world slid quietly into decline. All began with the collapse of a single man's mind. Rudolph II, the dreamer king in a harsh reality. Amid the bloodshed, intrigue, and ceaseless power struggles of medieval Europe, one name stands apart like a faint silhouette drifting through the smoke of reality. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia and Hungary. Unlike ruthless monarchs driven by war and ambition, Rudolph was a sovereign with a soul and artist, a man who adored painting, astronomy, and alchemy, but was far too fragile to bear the weight of a crown. His life was a dissonant symphony of brilliance and delusion, a reign marred by disorder and ending in utter isolation. Born in 1552 into prestigious House of Habsburg, Rudolph II was raised at the Spanish court, immersed in rigid royal customs and intense religious rituals. He inherited intellectual curiosity and artistic sensibility from his father, Emperor Maximilian II, but received little training in statecraft or leadership. From a young age, Rudolph showed signs of introversion, sensitivity, and profound love for beauty. When he ascended the throne in 1576, rather than building a strong, centralized court, he transformed Prague Castle into a cultural and scientific haven. There, luminaries like painters, philosophers, alchemists, and astronomers, including Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, found a rare sanctuary under his patronage. The castle brimmed with paintings, ancient manuscripts, exotic relics, and scientific instruments, creating an enchanting world completely detached from the volatile reality outside. But within that dreamlike world, Rudolph's mind began to fracture. Years of seclusion, obsession with astrology and mystical practices, and avoidance of governance led him further from reality. He became erratic, unpredictable, and convinced that the stars themselves guided his fate. As his mental health declined, his political judgment eroded, and he began making impulsive, destabilizing decisions. In an era where the emperor's authority was still absolute, the mental collapse of a monarch was nothing short of a crisis. Courtiers and nobles grew uneasy, and many quietly began seeking ways to strip him of his power. One of the most bizarre and tragic symptoms of his illness was glass delusion, a rare psychiatric condition in which the sufferer believes they are made of glass. Rudolf became convinced that his body was as fragile as crystal. He feared that a touch too firm could shatter him. Servants were ordered to move silently, speak only in whispers, and avoid making direct eye contact. The emperor wore heavily padded clothes beneath his royal robes, believing they would protect his breakable frame. His castle became a gilded cage, a palace turned into a mental prison, where he lived not as a king, but as a captive of his own fears. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire spiraled into chaos. Religious wars raged across Germany. The Ottoman Empire loomed as a constant threat, and within the empire itself, rival factions maneuvered for influence. But Rudolf was no longer capable of managing any of it. His younger brother, Archduke Matthias, took advantage of the turmoil to seize power. In 1608, Matthias forced Rudolf to relinquish control of Hungary and Austria. By 1611, Rudolf was compelled to abdicate the throne of Bohemia, retaining only the title of emperor, now hollow and powerless. Betrayed by his own kin and cut off from the fantastical world he had so carefully curated, Rudolf fell into deep silence. He died in 1612, in a quiet chamber devoid of echo, with no advisors by his side and no solemn procession. A lonely death for a life defined by isolation. His reign left behind few political achievements or military victories. But in the cultural memory of Europe, Rudolf too remains a singular figure, a symbol of the tension between an artistic soul and the crushing demands of kingship. People remember him as a dreamer in a cruel world, a delicate spirit trying to resist the weight of power with brushstrokes and starlight. Rudolph's story is a poignant reminder that power is not always strength. Sometimes it is a burden, and not everyone is meant to carry it. In today's world, where awareness of mental health is growing, Rudolf is no longer seen simply as a mad king, but as a deeply human figure, fragile and complex, who dreamed of a gentler world in which people like him could live true to themselves. Bad King John, a tyrant who accidentally planted the seeds of democracy. On a cold night in the 13th century, as flickering torches cast dancing shadows across the stone walls of the royal palace, they lit the calculating face of England's reigning king, the man history would come to know as Bad King John. At that moment, he could hardly have imagined that he, the most despised man in the kingdom, would one day be remembered for unintentionally laying the foundation for constitutional democracy in the Western world. Yet, such is one of the great ironies of history. John was the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the brother of Richard the Lionheart, the famed hero of the Crusades. When Richard died without an heir, John ascended the throne in 1199, becoming King John of England. But over his 17-year reign, he would gain notoriety for all the worst traits a monarch could possess: cruelty, cowardice, greed, and failure. John was hated by nobles and commoners alike. He raised taxes relentlessly, punished dissent with brutal force, and held no regard for legal principles. He seized lands from unsupported barons, took hostages to extort ransoms, and shamelessly abused royal power. Worse still, he frequently clashed with the clergy, expelling bishops and defying the Pope, which eventually led to England being placed under interdict, a severe religious punishment that unsettled the entire population and deepened their resentment toward the king. In matters of war and politics, John was equally disastrous. He lost most of the French territories that the Plantagenet dynasty had controlled, including Normandy, a region historically tied to the English crown. His campaigns against France ended in humiliation. His poor military strategy, paired with paranoia and a tendency to blame others, eroded trust even among his closest allies. Tensions reached a boiling point in 1215, when feudal barons, no longer willing to endure his tyranny, rose up and seized London. With little support and few options left, John was forced to negotiate. On June 15, 1215, at Runnymede, beside the River Thames, King John reluctantly affixed his seal to a document that would become a cornerstone of civil liberty, the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter of Liberties, contained 63 clauses that limited royal power, protected baronial rights, and most importantly, established the principle that the king was not above the law. While originally intended as a peace treaty between monarch and nobility, the Magna Carta became the foundation of constitutional government, enshrining the idea that law, not the ruler, is supreme, and planting the seeds of legal rights, parliamentary systems, and modern democracy. The bitter twist is that John had no intention of honoring the Magna Carta. Shortly after sealing it, he sought to nullify the agreement, plunging England into a civil war. He died in 1216 while conflict still raged. His son, Henry III, inherited the throne and was later compelled to reissue the Magna Carta, embedding it permanently into the political structure of the realm. Although John is often regarded as one of England's worst kings, labeled by historians as a thoroughly bad man, vulgar, treacherous, and devoid of honor, his failures inadvertently triggered a monumental shift. Forced to sign the Magna Carta, John became the unintentional catalyst for a historical transformation, from absolute monarchy to a government bound by law. The very idea of representative government, civil rights, and legal checks on power can trace their origins to that turning point in 1215. Thus, the legacy of bad King John is double-edged. On one side, a symbol of oppressive rule and the downfall brought by arrogance. On the other, a reluctant midwife for profound institutional progress. History, in its irony, shows us that the most reviled ruler may leave behind the most enduring contribution. And so, in the silence of night, long after the candles in his palace have burned out, the name of King John endures, not out of reverence, but because he stands as a timeless lesson. That power must have limits, and that the law must always outlast the throne. Vlad III, the dream and terror of a blood-soaked throne. Vlad III, more widely known as Vlad the Impaler, and in Western legend as Dracula, is one of the most controversial and chilling figures of the medieval era. Born in the early 15th century in a land torn apart by endless warfare among powerful empires like the Ottomans, Hungary, and Wallachia, the region he would one day rule, Vlad's life from the very beginning was bound to blood and violence. Yet what set him apart was not just military prowess, but the cold, calculated brutality of his rule, a deliberate reign of terror wielded as a political tool to maintain power and instill fear in both subjects and enemies. The method of impalement, a gruesome execution in which victims were pierced through with sharp stakes and left upright to die in agony, was not invented by Vlad, but he made it his horrific signature. Some records suggest that, during a campaign of revenge against the invading Turks, Vlad ordered the impalement of 20,000 people in a single event. The sight of thousands of skewered corpses standing like grotesque sentinels across open fields was so terrifying that even the hardened soldiers of the Ottoman army reportedly recoiled in horror. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople himself, allegedly turned back upon witnessing the carnage, declaring he was facing a man who did not belong to the world of humans. Vlad didn't use violence merely for punishment. He used it as a method of social control. He enforced ruthless laws to create what he saw as a perfectly ordered society. Legend has it that he placed a golden cup in the town square, and no one dared to steal it, a symbol of law through blood. Beggars, thieves, and anyone who broke his laws could be subjected to horrifying punishments. For Vlad, weakness had no place in leadership. In a world where betrayal and invasion were constants, only fear and ruthless strength could secure the throne. His brutality etched his image into both folk memory and history, to the point that myth overtook fact. Bram Stoker's iconic novel Dracula, though not an exact retelling, drew clear inspiration from Vlad's life, from the name Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, after Vlad's father, a member of the Order of the Dragon, to the idea of a reclusive lord in a dark castle, feeding off blood and haunting the nightmares of men. This blend of historical fact and dark folklore made Vlad III a global cultural icon, not just as a tyrant, but as the embodiment of shadow itself, a figure that personifies inescapable cruelty. Yet to judge him fairly, one must place Vlad within the harsh context of his time. Wallachia was a small, fragile principality, caught between larger powers constantly trying to dominate it. Previous rulers had been overthrown or assassinated. Vlad himself had been held hostage as a child. In such a world, a ruler could not survive long by being merciful. Every action Vlad took was a reaction to this brutal political landscape, a world where bloodshed was often the only way to retain the throne. He was not simply a mad butcher. He was a product of a time where hesitation meant death, and mercy was often seen as weakness. In Romanian memory, especially in regions like Transylvania and Wallachia, Vlad's image is mixed with both fear and pride. Many see him not only as a brutal ruler, but as a national hero who dared to defy the Ottoman Empire, a force that once threatened to engulf Europe. The stories of his cruelty evoke horror, but they also inspire awe. He is like a sharpened blade, one that could either protect a nation or sever its humanity. And that is the paradox of Vlad III, Dracula. A merciless executioner, but not without cause. A monarch with a heart hardened by necessity, but one constantly haunted by fear of betrayal. A cultural myth inspiring vampires and nightmares, yet a real man of flesh and blood. Living in a world so dark that to survive, he had to become something darker. History may remember Vlad III as a symbol of extreme violence, but when we look deeper, he becomes a mirror reflecting a deeper question that echoes through all political systems. When absolute power is the only means of survival, where do we draw the line of morality? Can we judge him by modern standards, or must we acknowledge that his cruelty may prolong the survival of a fragile state in a merciless world? Thus, the legend of Dracula lives on, not only in horror novels or Hollywood films, but in the blood-stained chapters of history, as a chilling reminder that sometimes monsters do not come from hell. They are born out of the desperate need to survive in a world without mercy. When crowns become cages, the madness behind the thrones. As we journey deeper into the shadows of history to uncover the lives of the most notorious kings of the Middle Ages, one question becomes unavoidable. Why did they become that way? Why did men born to rule, burdened with divine mission, descend into madness, cruelty, and tyranny? Were they born monsters, or did the circumstances of their age, the isolation of absolute power, and the crushing expectations of their status twist them into haunted and dangerous figures? The answer, like much of history, is never simple. But if we look closely with patience and empathy, a sobering truth emerges. Before they were tyrants, these kings were once children, thrust into a world so brutal that even grown men struggled to survive it. To begin with, it's important to understand that absolute power in the Middle Ages was not a gift. It was a terrible burden. When a child became king, in France, England, or Russia, it meant the end of childhood, replaced by a life of surveillance, control, and isolation. Kings like Charles VI of France or Henry VI of England ascended the throne before they were even teenagers. They had to learn how to act like rulers before they ever learned how to be human. Raised behind palace walls, their every word was scrutinized, their every gesture filtered through political games and courtly intrigue. Adding to this was a complete lack of understanding about mental health in medieval society. Symptoms of anxiety, depression, paranoia, or bipolar disorder were dismissed as madness, possession, or divine punishment. A king showing signs of instability wouldn't receive treatment. Instead, he would be subjected to prayers, exorcisms, or worse, exploited as a pawn in power struggles. Eric XIV of Sweden, for instance, was once a brilliant and artistic young man, but as his paranoia deepened, he became violent and delusional. Instead of being helped, he was imprisoned, poisoned, and reduced to a symbol of insanity in history books. Isolation was another invisible poison. Medieval monarchs had no true friends. They could trust no one, not even their own blood. Every relationship was tangled in ambition, betrayal, or political gain. When there's no one to speak to honestly, when no one dares tell the truth, the ego of a ruler can inflate and deform. Ivan the Terrible became so consumed by fear of betrayal that he created a private secret police to root out traitors, even among his closest advisors. In a fit of rage, he killed his own son, an unthinkable act, but one born of power warped by paranoia and loneliness. In truth, many of these kings were crowned too young, and it's a tragedy that repeats across royal history. They lacked emotional regulation, had no leadership experience, and barely knew themselves, yet were forced to make decisions that shaped nations. Their immaturity made them easy to manipulate, prone to panic, and increasingly detached from reality. With no systems of emotional support or psychological guidance, these royal children grew up inside golden cages, developing distorted worldviews and often becoming brutal not by nature, but by environment. Worse still, the medieval system of power itself nurtured madness. A king could command thousands of soldiers and order executions with a gesture, but he was completely helpless against the whispers in his own mind or the nightmares that haunted him. Rudolph II, who believed he was made of glass and could shatter from a loud noise, or Justin II, whose fits of rage and hallucinations paralyzed the Byzantine court, are proof that no amount of power can protect a fragile mind from its inner darkness. Looking back at these stories, what we need isn't only judgment, but compassion. These kings, for all their cruelty and failures, were also human beings lost in a world that allowed no weakness. It was the ignorance of the era, the isolation of absolute rule, and the childhood stolen by the crown that paved their path to destruction. So when we tell their stories at night, not to glorify, but to remember, we're not just learning history. We're learning about the human condition itself. That power, without empathy and wisdom, becomes a fire that consumes its wielder. And that sometimes what a person needs most is not a throne, but a hand to hold in madness, and a voice to ask if they're truly all right beneath the roar of kingship. In the quiet end of a long journey through the darkest thrones of the Middle Ages, one final question lingers. Why did they become what they did? Why did those born to rule, tasked with grand destinies, fall into madness, cruelty, and destruction? Were they born monsters? Or were they made, shaped by the crushing weight of history, the isolating nature of power, and the loneliness that came with the crown? The answer, like most truths in history, is never simple. But if we look closely with patience and open hearts, we begin to see something clear. Before they became tyrants, these kings were once children. Children pushed into a world so harsh, so relentless, that even the strongest adults might have broken under its weight. First, we must understand, absolute power in the Middle Ages was not a blessing. It was a burden. When a child ascended to the throne, in France, England, or Russia, it meant the end of innocence. Childhood was over, replaced by a life of constant surveillance, manipulation, and confinement. Kings like Charles VI of France and Henry VI of England were crowned before they reached adolescence, expected to act like sovereigns before they even understood how to be human. Raised in walled-off palaces where every word could be weaponized, where every gesture might be watched, these boys grew up without warmth, without trust. Worse still, medieval society had no understanding of mental health. Anxiety, depression, paranoia, and bipolar disorder were dismissed as madness, possession, or divine punishment. A king suffering psychologically wouldn't receive support. Only prayers, exorcisms, or political exploitation. Eric XIV of Sweden, once brilliant, artistic, and inquisitive, was eventually broken by paranoia and fear. But instead of being healed, he was imprisoned, poisoned, and remembered by history only as a mad king. Isolation is its own form of suffering. Monarchs had no true friends. They could not trust even family. Every relationship was draped in ambition and fear. And when no one tells you the truth, when no one speaks to you with honesty, your mind begins to twist in the silence. Ivan the Terrible, consumed by his fear of betrayal, built a private army to hunt down anyone he suspected, even his closest advisors. One day, in a fit of rage, he killed his own son, a moment of horror that shocks us, and yet, in his world of power and paranoia, it was an almost inevitable result. The tragedy of youthful kingship repeated itself across Europe. Children forced into power without emotional tools, without guidance, expected to steer nations while barely understanding themselves. They were too young to resist manipulation, too fragile to handle pressure, and over time, many were shaped into something they never chose to be. Not monsters by birth, but victims of a system that offered no compassion, no space to breathe, no room to be human. And tragically, the very structure of medieval power nurtured this madness. A king could command thousands, decree executions with a wave of the hand, yet be utterly helpless against the voices in his head or the memories that haunted him. Rudolph II, who believed he was made of glass. Justin II, who collapsed under raging delusions. These stories are painful reminders that no throne is strong enough to save a broken mind. What we need most as we retell these tales is not judgment, but empathy. Yes, these kings committed terrible acts. Yes, their names are etched in blood. But behind the cruelty, there was often forgotten childhood, a silent trauma, a misnamed illness. When we see them not as monsters, but as humans, flawed, frightened, and fractured, only then can we grasp the full weight of the tragedies they carried. These stories, however grim, are not just cautionary tales about power. They are gentle reminders of compassion, a quality any civilized society must protect. If the glittering halls of medieval palaces could crush fragile souls, then we must ask, has modern society truly become safer for the vulnerable? Or are we still repeating the same histories, only dressed in different clothes? So now, in the soft glow of your bedside lamp, as night wraps around you, take a moment to reflect. These mad kings, forgotten emperors, and tormented rulers, they are not just names in dusty books. They are mirrors, showing us the cost of unchecked expectations and unhealed wounds. They remind us that even the mighty break, that even the crowns suffer. And if there is one thing left to carry with you after all the blood and shadows, let it be this quiet hope that we can tell these stories with more kindness, that instead of only condemning and labeling, we can also listen to understand, to see that cruelty often grows from long-buried pain, that even those who harm may once have been harmed. As the tale draws to a close, as the ghosts of old dynasties retreat into the quiet, let your heart rest. Let the unanswered questions lie still. Let yourself drift into a peaceful sleep. And if in your dreams you find yourself walking past a moss-covered stone wall beneath a twilight sky, and you see a lonely king sitting in silence, don't be afraid. Remember, he too was once a child, yearning to be understood, aching to be forgiven. Good night. Sleep deeply. And when morning comes, carry with you a little more compassion, for that is the most meaningful legacy history can leave us.